In this chapter on fundamental rights, I would like to talk about the nature of the fundamental rights. In another video, I talked about the significance. I talked about an introductory remarks about how and what was the concept behind this, fundamental rights. Now, in this particular video, my focus is on what is the nature of fundamental rights in our constitution. Nature of fundamental rights. So, what are the special features of this fundamental rights? So, in fact, even in the significance, I mentioned that fundamental rights are individual rights. In a significance, I said that fundamental rights are very essential for a democracy, and society cannot be free. Fundamental rights are incorporated in the constitution to ensure that they are not violated in all circumstances. Of course, there is an exception is during the national emergency. So, now I am talking about the nature of the fundamental rights. First of all, in the nature also, we can always say fundamental rights are individual rights. So, first point is the same, fundamental rights are individual rights. This is what exactly I said even in the significance of fundamental right. It's okay, both are same. But number two, now one more things are different. Now, the second point is very important. Fundamental rights are enforceable against the state. So, it's a very important statement. Fundamental rights are enforceable against the state. The state, the country. We have talked about the state and the nation and all. State has four essential elements: government, the sovereignty, the territory, the people. So, we are talking about the state. And what is state? That is also defined in the constitution. Article 12 defines that. I will come to that. So, everything, when we talk about state, we are talking about the government. See, state includes all the organs of the government, the executive, the legislature, the central government, the state government, everyone will be included. So, we are saying fundamental rights are enforceable against the state, meaning if the state violates the fundamental rights of individuals, it has to be enforced. How will you enforce? You can go to the court. Okay. So, fundamental rights, that means the state should not, the meaning is the state shall not violate the rights of the people. The state shall not violate the rights of the people. People's rights are paramount. The state cannot violate. So, if the state violates the fundamental rights, you have a mechanism. That means any state machinery, whether it is police, whether it is the municipal authorities, whether any authority claiming that they are from the government of India or they have an authority from the state, authority from India, they cannot violate our fundamental rights. If they violate, we can approach the court. So, that is the meaning of the state. Fundamental rights are enforceable against the state. Now, you may be asking the question, if the state violates, we can go to the court. What about if a fellow citizen violates my fundamental right? If your neighbor violates your fundamental right or any other citizen violates your fundamental right, you can go to the police station. It is the duty of the state to help you in protecting your rights. If your fellow citizens violate your rights, the police and the state machinery will support you. The government will support you and help you in enforcing your fundamental rights. So, please understand, fundamental rights are enforceable against the state means you are, if the state violates, if any of the organ of the state violates your rights, you have a right to go to the court, Supreme Court or the High Court. So, that is the meaning of fundamental rights are enforced. So, the nature of the fundamental rights such that if the state violates, you can approach the court. Now, number three, fundamental rights are also known as the negative obligation of the state. And in fact, just before going into that negative obligation part, there is an exception to this, exception to the fundamental rights are enforceable against the state. There are a couple of exceptions. One, in case of untouchability, Article 17, even if fellow citizens are violating your rights, you have a right to go to the court. You can also go to the police, both. So, you can say Article 17, for enforcing Article 17, even if your rights are violated by a fellow citizen, you can directly approach the court. You can go to the police. If you have no confidence in the police, you can directly go to the court also. That is right against untouchability. Similarly, Article 23 and 24, that is related to right against exploitation. In case of right against exploitation also, you can directly go to the court or you can go to the police also. Both options are there. So, these are the two rights which are considered to be an exception to what I said, fundamental rights are enforceable against the state. In these two rights, Article 17 and right against exploitation, individuals have a right to directly go to the court also. So, it can be enforced against individuals also. So, please remember the second point I said, the nature of the fundamental rights are enforceable against the state, but there are two exceptions, Article 17 and Article 23-24. Now, the third nature is fundamental rights are negative obligation of the state, negative obligation of the state, meaning fundamental rights restrict the power of the state. Fundamental rights restrict the power of the state. The state cannot have that unlimited powers. The state has only limited powers. State has only limited powers. See, if the state has unlimited powers, then it will become tyranny. It will become anarchy, or I will say state will have absolute power, or rather the state will become autocratic. If the state has absolute power, if the state say I have full power, if they don't have, if it is not restricted, if it is not limited, see our understanding in a democratic constitution, even in a constitutional government, one fundamental thing is it's a limited government. So, fundamental rights restrict the power of the state. You have to respect the rights of the people. So, the power of the state, power of the police is restricted. See, police cannot hit anybody and everybody just like that. Police cannot use their lathis everywhere. They have to restrict, because they have to respect our rights. So, when they start respecting our rights, it is a restriction on the power of the state. And so, that is why, so it prevents, that is why most of the fundamental rights, it results in, it's negatively worded for the state, meaning the state cannot do certain things, state cannot violate the rights, the state has to respect. So, it is negatively worded, or it restricts the power of the state. That is why we call it as a negative obligation of the state. The states are obliged not to use excessive power against the individuals. They have to respect the rights of the people. They have to respect the fundamental rights of individuals. So, that is why we call it as a negative obligation of the state. It restricts the power, and we can say fundamental rights aim to prevent the executive and the legislature from becoming totalitarian. Fundamental rights prevent the executive and the legislature from becoming totalitarian. So, they prevent them from becoming totalitarian, and fundamental rights are a limitation on the power of the state. So, fundamental, I already mentioned that fundamental rights restrict the power, limited power, it is a limitation on the power of the state. It is a limitation on the power of the state. So, that is why we call it as a negatively worded, and it restricts the power of the state. Okay. So, then the next point is, a fourth point I would like to add here is, Fundamental rights are not absolute. Fundamental rights are not absolute. Meaning, you have the right. That does not mean that you can do anything and everything with that right. These are restricted rights. Or there can be reasonable restrictions on your rights. There can be reasonable restrictions on your rights. Meaning, see, you have freedom of speech and expression. That does not mean that you can abuse anybody. You have to, you cannot malign anybody. You cannot defame anybody just like that. So, you have rights. You can travel anywhere, does not mean that you can travel into anybody's private property also. So, these rights are restricted. It is not absolute. Reasonable restrictions are required, and unrestricted liberty becomes a license and jeopardizes the liberty of others. If you have unrestricted rights become a license. It become a license, and it can jeopardize the rights of others. So, you cannot have that absolute freedom, and if individuals are given absolute freedom of speech and action, it will result in chaos, anarchy, and ruin. It can result in chaos, anarchy, and ruin. So, individuals cannot have absolute freedom, but at the same time, the state cannot have unlimited rights. Sorry, the state cannot have unlimited powers. The state cannot have unlimited powers. If they have unlimited powers, this will become, it will result in tyranny. If they have the state has unlimited power, it will become authoritarian, it will become tyranny. If individuals have unlimited rights, then it will be chaos, anarchy, and so there has to be a balance. That is why fundamental rights are restricted rights. It is not absolute. You have reasonable restrictions on your fundamental rights can be, but there are two exceptions. One is Article 17 again, untouchability. There is no restrictions on this. I mean, it is an unrestricted right. Right against untouchability is an unrestricted right. There is no reasonable restriction can be. Similarly, right against exploitation. Right against exploitation is again unrestricted. It's absolute. Right against untouchability is absolute, and right against exploitation, this 23 and 24. 23 there can be, but at least the exploitation of children below the age of 14, it is unrestricted, or rather absolute. You have a right not to be exploited by anybody. It's an absolute right. So 23 and 24 and Article 17, the right against exploitation and right against untouchability can be termed as an absolute. Both can be termed as absolute rights. So they are, generally fundamental rights are not absolute, but two exceptions are there. Reasonable restrictions can be there. And one more point I would like, a fifth point I would like to add here: fundamental rights are not permanent. See, fundamental rights can always be, altered, or rather, for example, right to property was a fundamental right till 1978. Right to property, Article 31 was a right, till 1978. Till 1978. Later on, it has been removed. So, Parliament has the power to remove a fundamental right. So, fundamental rights are not permanent. Fundamental rights can be suspended. I will come to that later on. Suspended during national emergency. under Article 352, fundamental rights can be suspended, and also fundamental rights, and these fundamental rights are guaranteed and protected by the highest courts. As seventh point, another nature is fundamental rights are guaranteed and protected by high courts and Supreme Court. The highest of the courts guarantee and protect our fundamental rights. The fundamental rights are guaranteed and protected by the high courts and the Supreme Court. And one more point is, certain fundamental rights are exclusively available for the citizens. Certain rights are exclusively available, whereas certain fundamental rights are available for all persons who are in India. So, certain rights are exclusively available for citizens only, but certain other rights are available for all citizens, all persons who are in the soil of India, who are there in India under the command of Indian state, they enjoy certain rights. So, fundamental rights, certain rights are available exclusively and certain rights are available for all. So, when we talk about the nature of the fundamental rights, let me just repeat, there are 8 points I mentioned. One is fundamental rights are individual rights. Number 2, fundamental rights are enforceable against the state, but 2 exceptions I said. Then fundamental rights are negative obligation of the state. Fundamental right restricts the power of the state, and the state power, limited power, and fundamental rights prevent the state from becoming totalitarian or an authoritarian. Then number 4, fundamental rights are not absolute, reasonable restrictions can be there, but again 2 exceptions I already told. Then fundamental rights are not permanent, it can be taken away. Of course, Supreme Court has come up with the point of basic structure, I will come to that. So, subject to basic structure of the Constitution. Okay, fundamental rights are not permanent, Supreme Court can take away, Parliament can take away some rights, but subject to basic structure of the Constitution. Fundamental rights can be suspended during national emergency. Fundamental rights, certain rights are available exclusively for citizens, and some of them are available for non-citizens as well. So, these are the 8 points regarding the nature of the fundamental rights in the Indian Constitution.